wherever the country is moderately damp, from Cape Horn to North America. Differently from the Polyborus brasiliensis and chimango, it has found its way to the Falkland Islands. The turkey buzzard is a solitary bird, or at most goes in pairs. It may at once be recognized from a long distance by its lofty, soaring, and most elegant flight. It is well known to be a true carrion feeder. On the west coast of Patagonia, among the thickly wooded islets and broken land, it lives exclusively on what the sea throws up, and on the carcasses of dead seals. Wherever these animals are congregated on the rocks, there the vultures may be seen. The Gallinazo, Cathartes atratus, has a different range from the last species, as it never occurs southward of latitude 41 degrees. Azara states that there exists a tradition that these birds at the time of the conquest were not found near Montevideo, but that they subsequently followed the inhabitants from more northern districts. At the present day they are numerous in the valley of the Colorado, which is 300 miles due south of Montevideo. It seems probable that this additional migration has happened since the time of Azara. The Gallinazo generally prefers a humid climate, or rather the neighbourhood of fresh water. Hence it is extremely abundant in Brazil and La Plata, while it is never to be found on the desert and arid plains of northern Patagonia, except near some stream. These birds frequent the whole pampas to the foot of the Cordillera, but I never saw or heard of one in Chile. In Peru they are preserved as scavengers. These vultures certainly may be called gregarious, for they seem to have pleasure in society, and are not solely brought together by the attraction of a common prey. On a fine day a flock may often be observed at a great height, each bird wheeling round and round without closing its wings, in the most graceful evolutions. This is clearly performed for the mere pleasure of the exercise, or perhaps is connected with their matrimonial alliances. I have now mentioned all the carrion feeders, excepting the condor, an account of which will be more appropriately introduced when we visit a country more congenial to its habits than the plains of La Plata. In a broad band of sand hillocks which separate the Laguna del Potrero from the shores of the Plata, at the distance of a few miles from Maldonado, I found a group of those vitrified siliceous tubes, which are formed by lightning entering loose sand. These tubes resemble, in every particular, those from Drigg in Cumberland, described in the Geological Transactions. In a footnote. In the Philosophical Transactions, 1790, page 294, Dr. Priestley has described some imperfect siliceous tubes and a melted pebble of quartz, found in digging into the ground under a tree where a man had been killed by lightning. End of footnote. The sand hillocks of Maldonado, not being protected by vegetation, are constantly changing their position. From this cause the tubes projected above the surface, and numerous fragments lying near showed that they had formerly been buried to a greater depth. Forceps entered the sand perpendicularly. By working with my hands I traced one of them 2 feet deep, and some fragments, which evidently had belonged to the same tube, when added to the other part, measured 5 feet 3 inches. The diameter of the whole tube was nearly equal, and therefore we must suppose that originally it extended to a much greater depth. These dimensions are, however, small, compared to those of the tubes from Drigg, one of which was traced to a depth of not less than 30 feet. The internal surface is completely vitrified, glossy, and smooth. A small fragment examined under the microscope appeared, from the number of minute entangled air, or perhaps steam bubbles, like an assay fused before the blowpipe. The sand is entirely, or in greater part, siliceous, but some points are of a black colour, and from their glossy surface possess a metallic lustre. The thickness of the wall of the tube varies from 1/30th to 1/20th of an inch, and occasionally even equals 1/10. On the outside the grains of sand are rounded, and have a slightly glazed appearance. I could not distinguish any signs of crystallization. In a similar manner to that described in the Geological Transactions, the tubes are generally compressed, and have deep longitudinal furrows, so as closely to resemble a shriveled vegetable stalk, or the bark of the elm or cork tree. Their circumference is about 2 inches, but in some fragments, which are cylindrical and without any furrows, it is as much as 4 inches. The compression from the surrounding loose sand, acting while the tube was still softened from the effects of the intense heat, has evidently caused the creases or furrows. Judging from the uncompressed fragments, the measure or bore of the lightning, if such a term may be used, must have been about 1 inch and a quarter. At Paris, M. Hachette and M. Baudin succeeded in making tubes in most respects similar to these fulgurites, by passing very strong shocks of galvanism through finely powdered glass. When salt was added, so as to increase its fusibility, the tubes were larger in every dimension. They failed both with powdered feldspar and quartz. One tube, formed with pounded glass, was very nearly an inch long, namely 0.982, and had an internal diameter of 0.019 of an inch. When we hear that the strongest battery in Paris was used, and that its power on a substance of such easy fusibility as glass was to form tubes so diminutive, we must feel greatly astonished at the force of a shock of lightning, which, striking the sand in several places, has formed cylinders in one instance of at least 30 feet long, and having an internal bore, where not compressed, of full 1.5 inches, and this in a material so extraordinarily refractory as quartz. The tubes, as I have already remarked, enter the sand nearly in a vertical direction. One, however, which was less regular than the others, deviated from a right line, at the most considerable bend, to the amount of 33 degrees. From the same tube, 2 small branches about 1 foot apart were sent off. One pointed downwards and the other upwards. This latter case is remarkable, as the electric fluid must have turned back at the acute angle of 26 degrees to the line of its main course. Besides the 4 tubes which I found vertical and traced beneath the surface, there were several other groups of fragments, the original sites of which, without doubt, were near. All occurred in a level area of shifting sand, 60 yards by 20, situated among some high sand hillocks, and at the distance of about half a mile from a chain of hills 400 or 500 feet in height. The most remarkable circumstance, as it appears to me, in this case as well as that of Drigg, and in one described by M. Ribbentrop in Germany, is the number of tubes found in such limited spaces. At Drigg, within an area of 15 yards, 3 were observed, and the same number occurred in Germany. In the case which I have described, certainly more than 4 existed within the space of the 60 by 20 yards. As it does not appear probable that the tubes are produced by successive distinct shocks, we must believe that the lightning, shortly before entering the ground, divides itself into separate branches. The neighborhood of the Rio Plata seems peculiarly subject to electric phenomena. In the year 1793, one of the most destructive thunderstorms perhaps on record happened at Buenos Aires. 37 places within the city were struck by lightning, and 19 people killed. From facts stated in several books of travels, I am inclined to suspect that thunderstorms are very common near the mouths of great rivers. Is it not possible that the mixture of large bodies of fresh and salt water may disturb the electrical equilibrium? Even during our occasional visits to this part of South America, we heard of a ship, 2 churches, and a house having been struck. Both the church and the house I saw shortly afterwards. The house belonged to Mr. Hood, the consul general at Montevideo. Some of the effects were curious. The paper, for nearly 1 foot on each side of the line where the bell wires had run, was blackened. The metal had been fused, and although the room was about 15 feet high, the globules, dropping on the chairs and furniture, had drilled in them a chain of minute holes. A part of the wall was shattered as if by gunpowder, and the fragments had been blown off with force sufficient to dent the wall on the opposite side of the room. The frame of a looking-glass was blackened, and the gilding must have been volatilized, for a smelling bottle, which stood on the chimney-piece, was coated with bright metallic particles, which adhered as firmly as if they had been enamelled. End of Chapter 3, Part 2. Recording by Roger Turneau.